this is the second part of the How Close series featuring Epic the Musical, and in the previous part, I compared the Ocean Saga, the Troy Saga, and the Cyclops Saga to its literary counterparts in the Odyssey. And now, let's complete the rest of the songs before the Vengeance Saga comes along. Anyway, usual disclaimer, accuracy and closeness doesn't equate to being better, and I'm just here to show my love for Greek mythologies. Also, if you have any corrections, feel free to message them down below in the comments. Click here in the description below for part 1. Now, before I begin with the Cersei Saga, some corrections and connections from the previous video. Poseidon's killing of all but Odysseus' ship in Epic the Musical is reflective of how the Laestrygonians killed everyone but Odysseus' ship. The clamor from the ships was dreadful. My men were being destroyed. Ships were smashing into one another, with those huge monsters spearing men like fish and taking them to eat a gruesome meal. As my ship left the beetling cliffs behind, moving out to sea, but the other ships, those in the harbor, were totally destroyed. Another correction is that Antiphates isn't the king of the Laestrygonians, but instead Lamis. Antiphates was just the one that waged for the attack against Odysseus and his men. Also, I accidentally called the Ocean Saga the Storm Saga, so whoops, my bad. Anyway, let's continue. Let's start with the introduction to the Cersei Saga, where after Poseidon's attack on the ships, they seek refuge in Aea, where they encounter the goddess sorceress Circe. Puppeteer was pretty close to the original story, except that rather than sending his men out first, Odysseus was the one who went to survey the area before seeing the smoke from Circe's house. This is when he sent out his men. When they realized that they were being turned into pigs after eating the food that she gave them, Eurylochus was also the one to flee the area and report back to Odysseus. Much like the musical, he tells Odysseus that he stayed behind while the rest of the men entered, and then realized that she turned them into pigs. Child raised by Zeus, do not take me there against my will. Let me stay here. I know you won't be coming back again yourself, or bringing back the rest of your companions. No, let's get out of here, and quickly too, with these comrades here. We may still escape this day's disasters. Now we move on to Odysseus meeting with Hermes, who came to him with his gold wand and disguised as a young man in the heyday of his youth. Hermes in the musical and the story warned him that going to Circe without a plan is a death sentence, but with his help, Odysseus can survive this trial. The conversation in the song and the literature is pretty close with each other, where Hermes actually tells him what Circe does, like mixing a drink for him and drugging Odysseus, and that he will give Odysseus an herb that will prevent her spells from working on him. But the difference here is that Hermes actually warns him about Circe's intention of saving herself by weaponizing lust. And this is where the musical takes a stronger divergence from Circe's story. She will then be frightened and will desire you to go to bed with her. On this, you must not point-blank refuse her, for you want her to set your companions free, and to take good care also of yourself. But you must make her swear solemnly by all the blessed gods that she will plot no further mischief against you, or else when she has got you naked, she will unman you and make you fit for nothing. Another important note here is that Hermes actually also warns Circe that a hero named Odysseus would come here one day with his ship. So following this, we have the confrontation in Done For, which doesn't have that much divergence from the original story except for a back and forth every now and then, where they finally fight and Circe tries to affect him with her magic. But it doesn't work because of the molly Hermes gave him. But the bigger dive we'll focus on is There Are Other Ways. This plays off the same with the musical, except that Odysseus has no choice but to bed Circe here. Actually, they have a child together during the time that Circe and Odysseus were here. Telegonus, Agrius, and Latinus. Now, why this was most likely omitted from the musical is because Odysseus valued his integrity and loyalty to Penelope, and instead appeals to Circe by begging her to please let them go. This works consistently well with the previous songs, where Odysseus is a man of passion and plea, where he would do his best to keep his morals intact, and his love for Penelope and refusal to bed Circe is what actually sways the sorceress from killing him. It's this loyalty that convinces her, because she remembers acts of passion, and that she has been in love once before. This is also important in the future because this is what Athena uses against Hera to convince her that Odysseus never cheated on his wife, and even in the original mythology, he didn't. It was prophesied that Circe would coerce him to sleep with her and that he'd have no choice. But going back to the original literature, this characterization of story Odysseus as a man who has no choice but to bed a woman who could probably kill him if he's not too careful is also pretty consistent with the tones established in the original epic. Someone who is more self-serving and self-preserving if must. It's not to say that he didn't love Penelope in the original or is less loyal, but that he understands the power dynamic and gravity of the situation, especially since Circe is a goddess. And I answered, Circe, how can you expect me to be friendly with you when you have just been turning all my men into pigs? And now that you have got me here myself, you mean me mischief when you ask me to go to bed with you, and will unman me and make me fit for nothing. I shall certainly not consent to go to bed with you, unless you will first take your solemn oath to plot no further harm against me. It's also noted that even after he does bed her, the grief and fear of being stuck in her house with his men still being pigs makes him numb for days, making him unable to eat or drink. Circe obliged when she realized her actions and freed the men from her curse. They stayed on the island for a year, feasting upon an untold quantity of meat and wine. Actually, Eurylochus further questions why they're so willing to trust Circe after what just happened, which, honestly, understandable. He even accuses him that it was because of Odysseus' recklessness that the men in the Cyclops' cave were killed, but the men didn't listen to him and still stood by their king. After they stayed, the story continues with Circe telling Odysseus to travel to the Underworld and find the shade of the blind Tiresias, who even in death was bestowed upon by dread Persephone the power to understand. And now we move on to the Underworld Saga. The Underworld Saga in the musical begins similarly with its story counterpart, as the ship is heading off into the land of Hades. There's nothing too eventful that happened here that strays too far from the original, except that there's a more intricate process of getting to the Underworld. Several ritualistic sacrifices and prayers were required to not only enter, but to ensure their safe travels. Then out of Erebus came swarming up shades of the dead. Brides, young unmarried men, old ones worn out with toil, young tender girls, with hearts still new to grief, and many men wounded by bronze spears, who died in battle, still in their blood-stained armor. Crowds of them came thronging in from all sides of the pit, with amazing cries. This is where Odysseus finds his companion Elpenor, who was actually cut from the original epic the musical, whoops. The sadder part here is that Elpenor is actually the youngest crew member that survived the attack of the last Dragonians, only to die in Circe's island in the worst way possible. When Odysseus asks him what happened, this is what he says. In Circe's house, after I'd been sleeping, I didn't think of using the long ladder to get back again, so I fell headfirst, down off the roof. The impact broke my neck, shattering my spine. My shade departed and went down to Hades. He also sees his mother in the Underworld who perished while Odysseus was still away. They share a pretty sad dialogue together where his mom realizes that Odysseus hasn't arrived yet in Ithaca, and she goes completely mom mode telling him that he needs a sturdy ship and that he's been gone for so long but now he's here in the Underworld as a live man. His mother also tells him about what was happening with Penelope, Telemachus, and his father. Now, in the musical, he sees Polites in the Underworld, but remember that during this time, story Polites is still very much alive before the, incidents that are about to come, but we'll talk about them later. But Odysseus actually spent a lot more time in the Underworld than in the song, and he finds a questionable procession of wives and daughters of noblemen that came. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had to do several double takes here when I realized that I was reading some literal hanky-panky time in Afterlife, because I forgot that I was reading Greek mythology. Something Tyro and Poseidon. Actually, a lot of the accounts in the Underworld are accounts of women in Greek mythology who were either coerced into making love with the gods, made love to the gods, or got into the usual Greek mythology shenanigans like Oedipus's mom. He also sees Agamemnon and Achilles who talk about how they die. And unlike the musical, where it's portrayed that Odysseus is screaming and having a genuine panic attack during his travels to the Underworld, Greek Underworld with the right rituals is surprisingly pretty chill, courtesy of literally the best god in the pantheon. But this is immediately ended when Odysseus hears 1,000 tribes of those who died, and he realizes that he should leave before dread Persephone sends him to a monster. Now we move on to No Longer You, and you might notice notice that this isn't given the best spotlight despite being the pivotal moment in Epic the Musical Odysseus' character. In the musical, this is the moment where Tiresias' prophecy is vague but true, that Odysseus becomes such a changed man that he is no longer himself when he arrives home. Tiresias in the original tells the similar story. "Glorious Odysseus, you ask about your honey's sweet return, but a god will make your journey bitter. I don't think you can evade Poseidon, whose heart is angry at you, full of rage because you blinded his dear son. But still, though you will suffer, you may still get home, if you will curb your comrades and your heart. As soon as you've escaped the dark blue sea and reached the island of Thrinacia in your sturdy ship, you'll find grazing there the cattle and rich flocks of Helios, who hears and watches over everything. If you leave them unharmed and keep your mind on your return, you may reach Ithaca, though you'll have trouble. But if you touch them, then I foresee destruction for your crew, for you, and your ship. And even if you yourself escape, you'll get home again late and grieving, in someone else's ship after losing all of your companions." Now we move on to Monster, which is a great representation of the literary difference between Epic Odysseus and Story Odysseus. As mentioned previously, these two characters have different but not necessarily contrasting ideologies when it comes to doing what they must do for their own survival. This song is crucial to Epic Odysseus because he slowly comes to the realization that his want for balancing peace and pacifism has gotten them killed more times than saved him. It's a pivotal character moment that makes him challenge himself, and marks the transition into the next act. But this moment doesn't happen here for Story Odysseus, because while he's cordial and polite to those that he doesn't deem a threat, Odysseus isn't afraid to fight and kill for his men, or even compromise his morals if it is absolutely necessary. He's less of a good person and more lawful neutral in this regard, which is why the transition from the Underworld back into Circe's island in the story is less eventful. Now we move on to the Thunder Saga, where we see the last bits of Odysseus' journey. It's important to understand the themes that the Thunder Saga has for Odysseus as opposed to the original myth. Here, Odysseus' ruthlessness is on full display as a development for his character. There's a sudden transition between him being in the underworld and him being suddenly out of the sea and confronting the sirens. But it's made to play into the idea of fooling the listeners that he's singing to Penelope, which works well for a song about temptation. The original, though, has them returning to Circe's island, where she tells them about the sirens. In the musical, they circumvented this by having Odysseus be the one to deduce the presence of sirens through seeing a ship with no crew. But in this story, Circe tells them all about how sirens seduce men who unwittingly sails past them. She tells them to put wax in their ears and just row past. Another key difference here is that musical Odysseus is assumed to be walking around and actually conversing with the sirens, but in reality, Circe tells him that if he's so keen to hear the siren song, that his companions should tie him to the boat so he doesn't run overboard. Strangely enough, this is a pretty peaceful encounter, besides that they want to lure you into the water. While Different Beast really cements that musical Odysseus has become crueler to those that pose a threat against him and his crew, Story Odysseus just lets them be. In a way, the divergence between story and musical is the sub-theme that they represent. While musical Odysseus has to deal with mercy versus ruthlessness after getting shafted multiple times, Story Odysseus is just a man who is relatively powerless against the elements and has to genuinely come to terms with his mortality being the weakest possible bargaining chip. Now he has to face the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis, who Circe warns are powerful foes that can't be killed by manpower, especially the latter two. Story Odysseus actually even tries to ask Circe if there's a way for him to safely move past Charybdis and to naively protect his men against Scylla, where musical Odysseus makes the active decision to willingly sacrifice 6 of his men to the sea monster, by making them light up 6 torches. The lyrics even further that she and Odysseus were the same, that there was no price that they won't pay for their own survival. However, the torches being here make all of the difference when it comes to the scene, and while Eurylochus' anger is somewhat empathetic in the next song, the torches symbolized Odysseus' willingness to do whatever it takes, and he had an active hand in signing the deaths of 6 men instead of Scylla just being a natural obstacle. The original Odysseus had to make a difficult choice. sacrifice 6 men indiscriminately, including himself potentially dying to Scylla, or take the ship to Charybdis and risk all of them dying. Odysseus' selfish decision here, however, is him not telling the men that 6 of them will die, and that is a sacrifice that he was willing to take. Friends, up to this point, we have not been strangers to misfortune. Surely the bad things now are nothing worse than when the Cyclops with his savage force kept us prisoner in this hollow cave. But even there, thanks to my excellence, intelligence, and planning, we escaped. I think someday we'll be remembering these dangers too. All of you should follow what I say. Stay by your oars, keep striking them against the surging sea. When we saw Charybdis, we were afraid we'd be destroyed. Then Scylla snatched away 6 of my companions, right from the deck, the strongest and the bravest men I had. I turned to watch the crew and the swift ship. Already I could see their hands and feet, as Scylla carried them high overhead. They cried out and screamed, calling me by name one final time, their hearts in agony. Mutiny and Thunderbringer play a different role in the musical versus their confrontation in the actual story. And I'll emphasize again that adaptations don't need to always stick to the themes and representations of the original source material if it means keeping internal consistency and provides good storytelling. And drama! Who doesn't love a good drama? Musical Eurylochus is baffled that Odysseus would give the order to actively sacrifice 6 of his men to Scylla, instead of trying to fight her, leading to a full-on confrontation where Odysseus' men betray him and he is stabbed. But story Eurylochus has a different argument. They arrive to the island with Helios' cattle, and Odysseus says that they shouldn't stay here because of the prophecies. But Eurylochus refuses to listen to him any further. You're a difficult man, Odysseus, with more strength than other men. Your limbs are never weary. One would think you were composed entirely of iron if you refused to let your shipmates land, when they're worn out with work and lack of sleep. Here on the sea-girt island, we could make a tasty dinner. Eurylochus instead barters that the men should rest on the island and prepare a meal. Then they'd leave in the morning, and Odysseus was left with no choice but to oblige. But he made them swear not to harm a single herd of cattle and large flock of sheep, instead eating only what Circe gave them. They all agreed and they stayed the night. However, a storm catches up to them as Zeus stirs up a hostile wind, which made travel impossible and stranding them on the island for several days. Now, a few key differences here. It was a slow descent into hunger and chaos. Second is that there's less vibes about the infighting within the team, and more so just men who were desperate to survive by any means necessary, with Odysseus being the final reluctant acceptance in staying on the island. Third is that the eating of the cattle wasn't as unprompted as the musical makes it out to be. And now for the killing of the cattle. In the story, Odysseus wasn't actually there to stop Eurylochus from convincing the crew to eat the cattle. I washed my hands in a protected spot, a shelter from the wind, and said my prayers to all the gods who live on Mount Olympus. Then they poured sweet sleep across my eyelids. Meanwhile, Eurylochus tells the men that they should drive away the best of Helios' cattle and then sacrifice them to the immortal gods who hold wide heaven. And as appeasement, when they return to Ithaca, they'll make a temple for Helios where they will put expensive gifts as gratitude. Honestly, it doesn't sound that bad of an idea minus the whole double prophecy warning. If I didn't have hindsight, I'd say that this was a pretty good copium considering that they were about to die of starvation. At that point, they needed to try something. And while Eurylochus does get flack for not listening and getting everyone killed, the whole prophecy on the island seems more orchestrated than it first appears. Zeus allegedly sent the winds which forced them to deplete their food even if they were willing to leave first thing in the morning. Odysseus falling asleep in an area protected by Mount Olympus, and even Odysseus crying out and groaning to the gods that the sleep that they gave him was forced upon him and cruel, bringing about the doom of his entire crew. It's a cool contrast from the more human portrayal of this scene in the musical as man being weak to temptation and survival. It is instead emphasized that man is powerless against not only their basic needs, but also by the gods' will. So when the men did cook the meat and Helios Hyperion was informed, he immediately asked Zeus to please take vengeance on the companions of Odysseus, which leads us to Thunderbringer. Important context from the original story. Zeus wasn't as conniving or as directly involved, besides the occasional casting of winds against Odysseus' ship. Odysseus has been referred to multiple times as a son of Zeus due to his lineage, where Zeus appears around 2 to 3 times depending on the source material, meaning the fact that Zeus came to incur divine punishment against Odysseus and his men is already a big deal. But this is mostly because of Helios' threat to the gods. Helios knows that it wasn't Odysseus' fault that the men killed his animals, so he goes to Zeus and specifically says for him to kill Odysseus' companions, or else Helios himself will go to Hades and shine among the dead. This is an important characterization of Zeus that will be returned to later in my analysis of god games, because that's also a pretty big divergence. Zeus isn't a good god or a good entity either, God knows the last thing you need is to defend the guy, but he isn't directly malevolent towards Odysseus and definitely didn't give him the cruel option of choosing whether to spare himself or the men. The roar of the lightning strike that broke the ship is almost instantaneous. But musical Zeus is more lax in a horrifying way. The lack of Helios' threat and the vibe of the song really makes it seem that he's enjoying seeing the men suffer, and the added trauma to Odysseus when he tells him to choose is almost sadistic. But it hammers down this theme that we've seen with Poseidon and Aeolus. Gods don't have the best interests of humanity. The Wisdom Saga, as I previously mentioned in part 1, is actually the first part literary-wise in the story. I made the mistake of saying chronologically instead of literary, so oops, my bad. Actually, it's much harder to dissect this one because of the timey-wimey things, so the sequence of events may be off and I trust for your help in the comments. Anyway, Legendary is Telemachus' song, focusing on his desire to see his father again, but also to be a legendary hero like Odysseus. It also gives us the context of what's been happening at home. The suitors have finally grown tired waiting for a dead man and are pestering Telemachus and Penelope. It's a good starter for the tale. When Telemachus gathers all of the men in the first part of the story, he tells the tale of his noble father and how he hasn't received any report on his return. Telemachus goes on a really long rant on how these suitors are stuck at home and are wasting his and Penelope's time eating, drinking, and sleeping in a kingdom that wasn't theirs. Now remember, by this point, everyone is convinced that Odysseus is dead, so the men of the house were discussing that Penelope waited too long for this. This is also the part where Telemachus was trying to find resources for his voyage to try and look for his father. Eurymachus, all you other noble suitors, no longer will I make requests of you or speak of it, for gods and all Achaeans understand. Just give me a swift ship and 20 men, so I can make a journey and return to various places, to sandy Pylos, then to Sparta, to see if I can find some news about my father's voyage home. If I hear my father is still living and returning home, I could hold out here for 1 more year, although it's hard for me. If I learn he's dead and gone, I'll come back to my native land, build him a tomb, and there perform as many funeral rites as are appropriate. And after that, I will agree. She must choose a husband. Then we move on to Little Wolf, the confrontation between Antinous and Telemachus, and Athena meeting Odysseus' son. The fight between the both of them in the original story happens less with an actual fight and more of continuous proclamations of hatred, with Antinous calling Telemachus a proud and untamed spirit. But what I want to focus on is Athena and Telemachus meeting. Athena's meeting of Telemachus in the original wasn't just through divine intervention, but also her stealthily taking the form of a foreigner named Mentis. When Telemachus meets Mentis, he already feels in his heart that this wasn't a regular stranger, but nevertheless treats him with hospitality. Athena tells him of Odysseus being alive at sea. Their conversation here is actually slightly reversed in Will Be Fine. In the song, it's Athena that looks for comfort and advice from Telemachus as he shows her compassion while she was regretting the events of My Goodbye. But in the original myth, Athena was the one comforting Telemachus by providing him words of guidance and even empathizes with him by saying that Odysseus is bad for still wandering around when Telemachus needed him so much. How I wish Odysseus from way back then would now return and mingle with the suitors. They'd all come to a speedy end and find their courtship painful. But all these matters lie in the laps of gods. He may return and take his vengeance in his own hall, or he may not. But I'd encourage you to think of ways to force these suitors out, to rid your halls of them. It's partially because myths like this in story serve to cement the deific status of gods, which makes sense. Gods in Greek mythologies are less of rational and human characters, but more like concepts that embody the apex of principle, both its flaws and its good. Athena, as the goddess of wisdom in myth, is portrayed here as caring to Telemachus, but also with the same vigor as a god of war would. But why I believe that We'll Be Fine is needed in the original musical is because my goodbye happened, and the relationship between Athena and Odysseus was a central theme. It just shows you how adaptations can change the source material over time, but not necessarily for the worse. And I think that's the beauty of creativity. Now we move on to Love in Paradise, where the song ties in the events of the intro and establishes the current time skip between the Thunder Saga and the Wisdom Saga. Athena looks back into the past and what happens during her absence after my goodbye, seeing the tragedies that fell upon Odysseus and how he changed across the final legs of his adventure. We see that he ends up in the island of Calypso, where we meet the eternal goddess who traps Odysseus for several years. The island is known as Ogygia, and these 7 years were described by Odysseus as heartbreaking and grueling, as Calypso forces herself upon him as an immortal lover. Odysseus' stay in Calypso's island isn't as documented in the original myth because of the structure of Odysseus' accounts and the time skips in between them, but it is mentioned that Odysseus, who longed to get back to his wife and reach his home, was being held in a hollow cave by the mighty nymph Calypso, a noble goddess who desired to have Odysseus as her husband. Now to the final song of the current concept album and my favorite, God Games, where Athena asks for the permission of Zeus to set Odysseus free from the islet of Calypso, but Zeus challenges her to a game instead, where she must convince each of the gods that a man filled with shame like Odysseus deserves a second chance. Athena goes through Apollo, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Ares, and Hera and successfully garners their vote with witty counter-arguments in favor of Odysseus. But Zeus, angered that he was bested by his daughter and that his game was beaten, fights Athena and nearly kills her to an inch of her life. But it's important to understand Zeus's role in the original myth, which wasn't as outwardly hostile to Athena during this confrontation. Actually, he wasn't grandiose all throughout the myth, as we've seen how he had to micromanage the gods. Zeus's role in the Odyssey is less of a threat and more like the older brother that's genuinely trying to make sure that everything doesn't explode, because Helios threatened to leave the earth for some cow and Poseidon is pretty pissed off right now. He is more or less a reluctant mediator that might not be the wisest, but has no choice but to oversee the internal politics of this place, whether he wanted to or not. The confrontation begins with Zeus addressing the gods gathered in the Great Hall. He discusses another myth entirely regarding Aegisthus and the current politics happening with Clytemnestra and Agamemnon's death. But when she actually asks him to free Odysseus, Zeus is shocked that Athena would even insinuate that it's by his hand that Odysseus is stuck in there, and by no means does he call Odysseus a man filled with shame. My child, what a speech has passed your barrier of teeth! How could I forget godlike Odysseus, preeminent among all mortal men for his intelligence and offerings to the immortal gods who hold wide heaven? That's the reason Earthshaker Poseidon makes Odysseus wander from his country. But he has not killed him yet. So come now, let's all of us consider his return so he can journey back to Ithaca. Poseidon's anger will relent. He can't fight the immortal gods all by himself. Not with all of us arrayed against him. In Book 5, we see a more detailed account of what Athena said to the gathering. The gods were sitting in assembly, among them high thundering Zeus, whose power is supreme. Athena was reminding them of all the stories of Odysseus' troubles. She was concerned for him as he passed his days in nymph Calypso's home. Zeus says in response, "Did you not come up with this plan yourself, so that Odysseus, once he made it home, could take out his revenge against those men? As for Telemachus, you should use your skill to get him to his native land unharmed. That's well within your power. The suitors will sail back in their ship without success." I do want to emphasize that even if God Games isn't completely canon to the original story of the Odyssey, it doesn't make it any less valuable of a song in the canon of its own universe. Athena challenging her father, and technically her family, in a game of wits for a mortal man is the crucial character development that she needed from We'll Be Fine. Zeus being a nearly sadistic and almost cruel father figure to his own daughter is consistent with how he's portrayed in Thunderbringer and even in The Horse and the Infant. And this is where we can end the short analysis of how close was epic to the Odyssey. The music is splendid and catchy and gives an interesting retelling of Odysseus as a more jaded and rounded character versus how the Odyssey really portrays him. It works well on a theatrical level, even if the myth is more rigid and straightforward. But anyway, that's it for me today, and I'm excited for the Vengeance Saga. If you're curious why you can hear rain in the background, it's because there is literally a storm.